Good afternoon. My name is Judy Han, and as one of the coordinators, I'm very pleased and excited to welcome you to the 5th Annual Harvard International Development Conference. Planning the conference this year has been an extremely rewarding experience for me, particularly on a personal level. Whenever I have talked about my studies or my career aspirations, I've always been asked the same two questions. What is international development? And what are you going to do with it? But because of my involvement in the conference this year, through interacting with so many different practitioners, fellow students, through finding out what the hot topics are, and simply by searching for what is out there, who is out there, and what they're doing, I feel I was able to find much more clear answers to these questions. Therefore, I encourage all of you in the next 2 days to embrace what is offered to you through this conference. For professionals and non-students who are here, I hope this conference will be an opportunity to share about the work that you're doing and to meet with other practitioners in the field. And for many of you in attendance who are students, I hope that this conference will be a truly unique opportunity to not only discover new areas of interest, but to take this chance to really explore them and delve into them. The purpose of this conference is more than simply to introduce the current issues in international development. It's also to engage in a dialogue. This year's theme, Sharing Responsibility, Public, Private, and Civil Society, reflects the need to explore the different roles of the various sectors and the ways in which they may share the work for more effective development practices. We have purposely sought to convene leaders from every corner from the practice of development, from the head of Women's World Banking, which is a nonprofit microfinance organization, to the former Undersecretary for Social Policy for the government of Argentina, and to the president and CEO of Guidant Corporation, which is a healthcare firm. In all, we're very honored to have with us this year over 40 speakers who will be participating in 12 different panels. We also envision this conference as an opportunity to develop a network among current and future professionals in this field. And to this end, the schedule includes events such as a reception later this evening, and career workshops with some of our panelists tomorrow afternoon. And I can say with confidence that there are very few occasions where you will interact with such a unique gathering of individuals who are connected with development. The conference committee has put together an agenda that we hope will achieve all of these purposes. And in the spirit of this year's theme, I encourage you to learn about all the different perspectives and sides of the development debate, and perhaps decide for yourself what it means to be sharing responsibility. So for those of you who have been asked those same two questions, what is international development and what are you going to do with it? I hope that what you take away from this conference will help you to further clarify and deepen what your response as well. Thank you very much. All this would not be possible without the support and hard work of many individuals. First, I'd like to thank the Kennedy School of Government Institute of Politics and the Center for International Development for their support and guidance. I'd like to thank our many speakers who really form the quality and the substance of the program this year, and also our sponsors who generously contributed to this conference. And finally, I would like to thank and congratulate the organizing committee members made up of students from the Kennedy School, Harvard Business School, and the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy for all their dedication and commitment to putting this conference together. And now I would like to introduce our next speaker, who will be serving as moderator for this afternoon's keynote session. Sarah Sievers is the Executive Director of the Center for International Development, and she's also a Development Associate with the Harvard Institute for International Development. Prior to coming to Harvard, Ms. Sievers worked as a Foreign Service officer for the State Department, serving as Vice Consul for Political and Economic Affairs in Kiev, Ukraine, and also serving as Special Assistant to the Assistant Secretary for Legislative Affairs in Washington, D.C. Ms. Sievers received her undergraduate degree in government from Harvard College and her MBA from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Thank you. Sarah?
Thank you very much. Thank you, Judy. As someone who's been watching the students and the committee plan this event, I can say they put months and months and months worth of effort, and I'd like to thank them very much for inviting me to be a part of it and for including the Center for International Development in the proceedings. Before introducing the panel, they had asked me to talk a little bit about some of the challenges and difficulties facing international development. I wanted to start off by giving you some good news, and so decided that I was going to turn a little bit first to something that's a little bit unusual for starting a speech at the forum, and that is a letter from home. But home for me is the Marshall Islands, about halfway between Australia and Hawaii. And the letter that I got is from someone who is former chief judge, hospital administrator, special prosecutor, not that kind of special prosecutor, and currently high school principal. I think it gives you a flavor of the ground level of what international development work can be like. Dear Sarah, the school is crazy. One of the 2 buses is down, which is awful. How will we get the kids there? I can't even find the part that's broken. First it's supposed to be with one person on one island, and then with another person on another island. The phones are broken between the islands. And the boats only go in the mornings, at noon, and in the afternoons to evening. So trying to figure out where the part is, whatever part it is, takes forever, and I'm supposed to be getting ready for school. The truck is broken too. That's what the Monsignor sends. And it's west winds now, which causes the big winds to crash stuff into the lagoon side of the island. It was high tide the past several days, so the causeway was full of rocks and nothing could pass, which didn't matter because we didn't have buses anyway. They cleared most of it off by the afternoon, but most of the teachers didn't come because of that trouble with the rocks and what they do to the tires. The cookhouse doesn't have electricity yet. I'm trying to get volunteers from here to hook it up. I got 2 excess stoves from the Army last spring, but they're in the library now, along with a lot of other stuff, so the librarian won't come. The good thing is that there are others here who care and are really trying, like the Monsignor, who's very supportive, and the dear man who gave me a ride. He's lovely and said he'd help with the buses, so I'm going to look him up today. And the JIV teachers are terrific, full of energy and goodness, and undaunted by problems, taking whatever assignments they're given. And the new woman from California has just spent 2 years in Africa, so she's a real trooper. Marcella is lovely. She'll be a good friend, and Tom, the ex-Jesuit who was fired from his last job, is really trying, although he got in a big fight with the bus driver, who then quit. But maybe he's coming back. I talked with him yesterday. There are not enough kids to pay for the planned expenses, now only 130 out of 200. Marcella, the past principal, said that 60 kids took the entrance exam for the 9th grade, but she passed only 19. She might be right, but I don't know how we're going to pay the teachers. I'm panicked on this one. The variety of challenges that we face in international development are truly stunning. But the goodness and excitement of people like the panelists we're about to hear from today really compensate for a lot of the difficulties that we sometimes encounter along the way. I'd like to start now by introducing our 3 panelists and then opening up the discussion for their comments. Carol Bellamy is the 4th Executive Director of the United Nations Children Fund, UNICEF. Prior to her appointment at UNICEF in 1995, she served as Director of the U.S. Peace Corps, where she had served earlier as a volunteer. 5 years in the New York Senate, and the first woman president of the New York City Council. Her private sector activities include time as associate at the law firm of Cravath, Swaine & Moore, and in senior positions at Morgan Stanley & Company, Bear Stearns & Company. Ms. Bellamy received her law degree from the New York University and her undergraduate degree from Gettysburg College. Welcome. Michael Fairbanks currently directs Monitor Company's country competitiveness practice. He has, over the past decade, advised government and private sector leaders in much of the developing world, including Africa, the Middle East, and Latin America, as well as the World Bank. Oh, we're not sure if that counts as the developing world or the developed world yet, but he's been there doing his work. Monitor's country consulting work has been reviewed in approximately 600 newspapers and magazine articles in nearly 24 countries. And as a student not too many years ago, I can attest to the fact that it's one of the most popular places for an aspiring young college graduate to end up professionally. Welcome to you as well. Jeffrey Sachs is the Galen L. Stone Professor of International Trade in the Economics Department at Harvard University, and currently serves as the director both of the Harvard Institute for International Development and the newly established Center for International Development. He's advised numerous governments throughout the world, including Poland and Bolivia and dozens of other countries, and has published numerous articles and books on the subject of international trade, East Asian financial crisis, and many other topics as well. Welcome, Professor Sachs. Ms. Melanie, we'll turn over to you.
I think I'll make my initial remarks from here, not to make it too stuffy, and then sit down for the Q&A. I'm delighted to be here to talk about these public, private, and civil society sharing responsibilities. As you heard from my introduction, I've either been lucky enough or I can't hold a job, but I've held many different kinds of positions, both in the private and the public sector. I have been a banker and a lawyer and a politician. I only need to do real estate, and I will have done every sleazy profession that one can begin. So allow me to offer some comments. The best thing I ever did was Peace Corps. We got 2 of the 4 up here are Peace Corps, so that's okay. That makes it okay. I'm actually have some prepared remarks because I am the champion of the run-on sentence. So since we should try and keep to some time constraints here, I think I will generally use my prepared remarks and then try and respond, I hope, relatively usefully in the exchange. The United Nations was founded to end the scourge of war, to reaffirm faith in fundamental human rights, and to promote social progress and better standards of life in larger freedom. For more than half a century, the UN and its agencies, of which we are one, have vigorously pursued these and related objectives, and they've done so by working almost exclusively with governments. But the end of the Cold War and the growing economic interdependence among nations have led to a profoundly important perceptible shift. As the Secretary General, Kofi Annan, put it recently, we now know that peace and prosperity cannot be achieved without a broad expanse of active partnerships that involve sharing responsibilities not only with governments, but with international organizations, civil society, and the business community. Further, at Davos this year, in all that snow, which got worse, the Secretary General told corporate leaders that, and I quote, "In today's world, we depend on each other. The business of the United Nations involves the businesses of the world." Indeed, it is abundantly clear that without development and peace, trade and investment cannot occur, and business cannot grow. By the same token, thriving markets can help create the conditions necessary for development and peace, by creating jobs, by improving standards of living, and by making it possible for developing countries to share in the benefits of the world economy. Let no one doubt the urgency, however, of this task. In a global economy worth nearly 30 trillion, I didn't check the Dow today, 1.5 billion people, a quarter of the human race, are still living in conditions of almost unimaginable suffering and want. And of those, 650 million of them are children. Never in history have we seen such numbers, and never in history have we seen overall aid to the world's neediest countries fall to such shameful levels as they have in recent years. Yet there has never been a time when development assistance actually has been more needed, or that the evidence of its past successes, although not everything has been a success, more compelling. The UN has been active in promoting a variety of approaches to development and in laying the groundwork for greater development cooperation, including cooperation to promote the survival, protection, and the full development of children. Only the UN, with its universal and comprehensive mandate, can offer a central forum to address sustainable human development in all of its aspects, and to build the consensus that's needed to achieve it. Only the UN has the operational potential to address the global imperatives that must be met, from humanitarian relief and peacekeeping to peace building and development cooperation. But at the same time, amidst all of this, the UN is working to promote private sector development and to direct foreign investment. It is helping, with others, countries to join the international trading system and to enact legislation aimed at encouraging responsible business practices. And on the ground, it's promoting microfinance. Most of the good, or at least the microfinance that's working, is with women. As well, it is promoting small traders and entrepreneurs. Even UNICEF does that in promoting salt ionization and our salt producers. Business has a compelling interest in the success of these efforts. For thriving markets and human security go together, go hand in hand. We cannot have one, or we probably can't have one, without the other. One widely talked about rationale for the United Nations working in partnership with industry and the business community is based on the assumption that the resources of government are not plentiful enough, and that if development is to succeed, we must look for these resources in the private sector and in the marketplace. I would submit that this is actually quite a poor rationale for this partnership. I think it's poor for a couple of reasons. First, it is based on the mistaken idea that governments should be allowed to shirk their responsibility as the leading players in development, and I'd like to return to this issue in a moment. Second, it is a poor rationale for partnership because it is based on a limited and almost patronizing view of what the private sector can bring to a relationship with the United Nations, and that is namely money. The problem is that by itself, money is not the commodity one would hope to have it be. It makes business and industry suspect that they are being courted for their dollars or whatever currency, not for their capacity. In fact, the private sector has an immense store of knowledge and experience. It has vast numbers of talented and insightful people. And numerous companies, have undertaken beneficial and innovative projects in countries that are in desperate need of help. Moreover, the private sector has a major role to play in the realization of human rights, from such issues as child labor practices to gender equality and to the protection of the environment, just to name a couple. Obviously, the UN system looks to the private sector as a source of funding for multilateral development assistance. But it is, as I would suggest, also important to see the private sector in a more expansive context, as a source of knowledge and expertise for multilateralism. That being said, at the same time, we in the United Nations, we on the multilateral side, on the development side, must also be mindful of something else, that in dealing with the private sector, we cannot be uncritical. To begin with, it is dangerous to assume that the goals of the private sector are somehow synonymous with those of the United Nations, because they aren't. Business and industry are driven by the profit motive, as they should be, and must be, for both their shareholders and for their employees. The work of the UN, on the other hand, is driven by a set of ethical principles that sustain its mission, principles set out in the Charter of the United Nations, in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, in the Convention on the Rights of the Child, and elsewhere in the galaxy of international instruments and treaties that have been promulgated since the founding of the UN in 1945. The founders had two things on their minds at the end of the Second World War. One was to prevent a third World War. Sure done a great job in that. The other was to avoid other global economic depression and to ensure universal economic and social well-being. That vision was based on a set of universal principles and values: freedom, justice, and the peaceful resolution of disputes, social progress and better standards of living, equality, tolerance, and dignity. Just as the private sector is not embarrassed by the fact that it is driven by profits, the UN is hardly self-conscious that its work grows out of underlying ethical principles. It is perfectly right and legitimate for both to be pursuing their singular mandates, and where they can work together as partners, so much the better. But in coming together with the private sector, the UN must carefully and constantly appraise the relationship. It is one thing to say that we want to work in partnership with corporations that recognize their responsibility for human rights, who care about labor codes, working conditions, environmental protection, and the like, but these are generalities. The heart of the matter, as far as I'm concerned, is the exercise of due diligence. The UN must look carefully at companies, This does not mean putting them under a microscope, fixing them with a degree of scrutiny that few of us could pass. But it does mean identifying organizations whose behavior on balance shows evidence of a willingness to exercise corporate responsibility. We, I think at UNICEF, have generally been able to do that on balance, not perfectly. And despite the fact, and I think few people realize this since we're the children's agency, but that probably of UN agencies, we may have the most extensive corporate involvement of any single UN agency, largely because we raise a third of our funding from the private sector. We are careful. We make mistakes sometimes, but we're careful. For instance, we attach ethical strings to our supply contracts, favoring companies that pledge to avoid links with such activities as landmine production and exploitive child labor. We do not deal with cigarette companies or accept contributions from manufacturers of infant formula. With these sorts of ground rules as a foundation, we then attempt to enter into partnerships that make sense. For example, Warner Brothers, Turner Network Television, Time for Kids, and Coinstar are all key supporters of our Trick or Treat. I always do that, as though there's a little orange box at the end of my hand. All part of our Trick or Treat for UNICEF campaign. And companies like British Airways, the Sheraton and Westin hotel chains, and American Express are involved in UNICEF marketing efforts linked to specific fundraising activities. In half a century, we have learned a few things about private sector partnerships. We've learned that they should not exceed expectations. They should not be based on unwarranted assumptions. And they should not be focused solely on money, for that will surely sour the relationship. Let me turn now to another aspect of partnerships for development, those involving NGOs. It is a truism that NGOs in their numbers and diversity have proven themselves absolutely indispensable in development efforts, especially given the perpetual crisis of multilateralism, the crisis that tends to revolve around funding and humanitarian capacity. But however generous and expansive their motives, many are not immune from legitimate criticism. For example, there is some criticism of some in the NGO community for not being sufficiently sensitive to the fact of overlap and redundancy among some of the NGO organizations, whether national or international. That said, it is also true that NGOs have not, in many cases, been sufficiently well treated by those who take the crisis of multilateralism seriously. And by well treated, I am not talking so much in terms of money as I am talking about the recognition that NGOs deserve in terms of what they do and how well they do it. For example, NGOs have not been consulted nearly enough about the humanitarian imperatives. They have not been part of the decision-making process over how priorities are set in the field. They have too few opportunities to meet with major multilateral agencies and to help in devising ways to pool efforts and to share operational authority. Now let me turn to another issue, generally in conclusion, although I have a couple more comments. That's the central issue of sharing responsibility. It's a matter of partnerships with the public sector, namely the governments. There has been considerable discussion in recent years of the potential for ending the crisis of development assistance through the natural working of the global market economy. And Jeffrey Sachs, I'm sure, will speak more to this and more capable than I can. The chief evidence cited is the fact that private sector funding and investment in developing countries has been rising dramatically. This is true. Even as development aid has dropped, private capital flows have increased and now represent close to 80% of the total resources that go to developing countries each year. I think that's about nearly twice what it was in 1990. But private capital seldom gravitates to the very neediest countries. In 1995, for example, all but 20% of total private flows went to just about 12 developing countries, while the 49 countries in sub-Saharan Africa received slightly more than 5%. Moreover, in those countries that it does reach, private capital often does very little for the poor. It tends, for the most part, to be focused on hard infrastructure, roads, bridges, and communications. Not unimportant, but that's the focus. Only rarely do we find it supporting the development of such essential social services as private health care or basic education. More to the point, private capital will not find its way to countries that lack an adequate social and economic infrastructure, which is precisely what multilateral aid is aimed at helping poor countries to build. Investors are well aware that there will be no return on their investment unless a society has the capacity to put its resources to effective use. That is why it is so important to help countries to improve their health and their education systems, particularly education for girls, to have clean water and adequate sanitation, to practice good governance, and to use communication and information technology to promote knowledge and greater understanding among peoples and cultures. All of this is not only smart social policy, it is good business. It is smart business. Multilateralism has always sought to address basic human needs, and it is now particularly consumed by questions of poverty eradication. Yet at a time when even modest increases in aid to the world's poorest countries could save the lives of millions of children and women, ODA is in a state of virtual free fall. Ladies and gentlemen, let's call this situation by its proper name. It is a scandal. The developed world, which is benefiting so vastly from globalization, cannot be allowed to be deficient in its obligations to the developing world, which are not merely compassionate and generous, but also a recognition that only by building an adequate human and development infrastructure in the developing world can you have a world economy that will be one day stable and vibrant. For all the importance of NGOs and other representatives of civil society, for all the potential value of development partnerships with business and the private sector, we must never lose sight of the fact that it is government that remains the primary actors, not the sole actor, but the primary actors in this fundamental relationship for development. It is the governments that have thought long and hard about the development imperatives. It is they who have set the targets and made the commitments. It is governments that sit on the executive boards of multilateral agencies. It is governments that think about development as a matter of social policy, who have development ministries and foreign ministries that fashion the world's humanitarian and political agendas. For practical, legal, and moral reasons, governments must be held to their commitments. No one should pretend that simply getting more money from the private sector will compensate for the failures of the public sector. The phenomena of globalization has opened the possibility of untold riches, but it has also shown its power to trigger the progressive impoverishment of large societies, such as Indonesia, for example, where tens of thousands of families have fallen into abject poverty in the last 2 years. There is a belief among many people that globalization is a process that is with us, and will be with us, as irresistible and beyond human control as the tides. In fact, it is the product of deliberate, day-to-day policy choices. And that is why, ladies and gentlemen, we must not let governments off the hook. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ms. Bellamy. Now for a view from the private sector, Mr. Fairbanks.
Set up to get killed here. Now from a view from the private sector. So I agree with everything that she said. So it's just like that. I was very inspired when I came to learn that Carol would be on the panel, because she had been a Peace Corps director, the entire Peace Corps in the mid-90s, and I had been a Peace Corps volunteer from 1979 to 1981. And although I have to defer to Carol because she was a Peace Corps volunteer when in the 60s, and those were the real Peace Corps volunteers. Those were the real ones. Those were the ones who, you know, romantically created the environment for the rest of us to go, and so I have to pay homage to her on this. Well, when I understood that she was going to be my fellow speaker, I started to reflect on how I might open up with the Peace Corps. And I can remember I was 20 years old, and I was due to be sworn in on my 21st birthday, which is the legal requirement for Peace Corps. And we went out to our first staging to live in a village for 5 days and to, you know, use a hole in the ground instead of a bathroom and all of that. And I can remember seeing all the people my own age in the village working incredibly hard, long days, picking coffee, you know, toiling in the soil, getting dirty. They had no shoes. And as the son of a philosophy professor who never really had a job, I started to wonder, why did I have so much and had done so little for it, and why were these Africans working so hard and had nothing? And it all came together for me in a conversation in the first weeks as a peace creep out there in Kenya, that when a student of mine came up to me and he said, "Mwalimu, teacher, give me a pair of your shoes." And I said, "Well, I have my running shoes and I have my clodhoppers, you know, the old work boots." And I said, "The one I use for walking around, the other one I use for running every day." And he said, "But sir, I have no shoes and you have 2 pair, so give me one of your pair." And I was faced with my own mortality because I thought I was a good person and I thought I joined the Peace Corps for the right reasons. And I told him, "No, you can't have my shoes." you know. And then another guy came and said, "Sir, I would like something to remember you by." I said, "Well, I just got here. You know, I'm not leaving. But I'm happy to give you a photograph. We can take a Polaroid of the 2 of us." And he said, "But sir, I would prefer your radio. That would help me remember you better." And I was like, "No, you can't have my radio, you know, just go away." But it started me on a quest for why they worked so hard and had so little, and why I worked so little and had so much. And it took me a long time to begin to figure it out. And it had something to do with the productivity of the environment they were in, and it had something to do with the choices, implicit or explicit, that were being made by their governments, their private sector, and by the individuals. And so I set out to figure out what are those choices going to be. The first thing we have to understand as we go down this path, my mouth is getting dry because I'm so in awe of the Peace Corps director here. There we go. The first thing we have to understand is, what is prosperity? There's 2 ways to look at prosperity. The first way is to think of it as a flow. It's the income that goes to somebody. And the best way to look at that nowadays is purchasing power, not GNP per capita, but purchasing power per capita. What can someone in India, someone in Africa buy to make shelter for their homes, nutrition for their children, you know, make their lives better? So we look at purchasing power, and you can see a big difference. Romania's GDP per capita is about $1,400. The purchasing power is around $3,500. There's big differences when you start just to change this metric. But you become more philosophical when you start to think of prosperity as a stock. What are the stocks of prosperity? Natural resources, institutions, infrastructure, human capital, knowledge capital, which is now coming into fashion. You know, what are the stocks? And I started to realize as I looked around the developing world for the first time, not such an organized fashion, I started to realize their enabling environment was not good enough to create these flows of purchasing power that would go to the average citizen. And something in the environment I came from enabled a better flow to me. So I've started to think lately, well, why is prosperity important? Second big question, why is prosperity important? Because you go to Africa and sometimes you'll meet, you know, vaguely left-leaning academics, you know, just sitting there, Cambridge trained, you know, the other Cambridge trained, and they dependency theorists and all that. And you meet up with them and they say, "Why don't you leave us Africans alone?" I'm like, "Well, I didn't just come here. Somebody asked me, you know, I'm just here because somebody asked me. Why don't you leave us Africans alone? You know, this is the Berlin Conference again. This is 1884. The colonials are dividing up the continent." Or you go to Eastern Europe, and the question I always hear is, "What makes you think you can solve our problems? Our problems are unique." That's the big thing I hear in Eastern Europe. Or in Latin America, "We may be poor, but we're happy people." And I started to think, well, maybe they're right. Prosperity is, maybe it doesn't matter. So I started looking into the literature outside of the economics literature, outside of the business strategy literature, where I'm most familiar. And I found there was this deep reservoir of work in the sociological literature and the anthropological literature that shows that there are positive correlations between prosperity and the ability for people to be tolerant towards people not like themselves. A wonderful study. I found a correlation between prosperity and self-esteem. I found work that showed there was a link between prosperity and civic engagement. I found there was all these wonderful links that cut across religion, ideology, nationality, and even education and gender. And I started to think, maybe all of us here today and that care about these issues are really on the right track. It turns out that whenever I go to a country, I can look at 3 basic interpretations by why the prosperity is not working. The first interpretation, which can be personified by maybe Mike Porter over at the business school, is the macroeconomic or business strategy interpretation. This is the one I understand best. Everywhere I go, I find patterns of uncompetitive behavior in the private sector. They parentalize the government for favors and seek access to raw materials which don't give them a sustainable advantage. They don't understand their customers nor their competitors. They rarely forward integrate into markets. They do some things that are just wrong. And this is the business strategy interpretation. Broad product scopes, not understanding their cost structures, underinvesting in the training of their workers. These things are just wrong. They're now universals around the world. If you do certain things right, you can make your companies better. The second interpretation, which is maybe perhaps best personified anywhere in the world, is the macroeconomics interpretation, and maybe that's by Jeff Sachs. And I start to think, what have been some of Jeff's contributions to the work of interpreting how prosperity gets made? Well, everybody knows the story now of 1985 in Bolivia, 20,000% inflation, and a young, unknown economist goes down there. They didn't even know him in Bolivia, and he helped them open their economy, make tough choices, begin to think long term, create the conditions for private sector success. And I think one of the reasons for Jeff's success has been he's not only been a world-class academic, he's a doer, he's a practitioner. And when you think about why he succeeded, my own view is because he is as good at diffusing the messages of macroeconomic stability as he is at coming up with what the paradigm is supposed to look like. So there's the macroeconomic interpretation: fiscal stability, currencies valued to reflect the underlying productivity of the nation, investing in people, outward orientation, firms competing. Well, then there's a third interpretation of why prosperity doesn't get created. And this one is the most elusive, the most difficult one to talk about. And that's the interpretation about mental models, mindset. You know, it turns out that some groups of people in different countries, but also within countries and within cultures, are more open towards innovative thinking, long-term thinking, interpersonal trust, believing in complexity. They're attitudes that reside in different cultures and deep inside the cultures that create the conditions for success. Now, I often tell a story, and some of you will have heard it already, but it bears repeating. We did some work for the Colombian government and private sector a few years ago, and they asked us to help their leather sector. So we started in the United States as good management consultants, briefcases, laptops, you know, and we talked to 2,000 retail outlets across the United States of why they would buy leather handbags and why don't they buy Colombian leather handbags. And they told us that the prices were too high and the quality was too low. So we started on our journey and we met the manufacturers in Colombia and we asked them, what's the problem? And they said, well, the tanneries are protected with 15% tariff protection, and so they don't have to compete very much, and their quality is very low, so we don't have good hides to work with. So we went to the tanneries and we said, well, we understand you're protected and that's the problem. And they said in Spanish, no es nuestra culpa, it's not our fault. It's the fault of the slaughterhouses, because when they kill the cow, they take the meat and they destroy the hide, so when we get the hide's no good. So we went to the slaughterhouses and almost got sick. I remember having to run out. So it was such a grotesque environment. And we asked them, they said, oh, it's not our fault. It's the fault of the ranchers, because when they brand the hide to protect it from the guerrillas coming down out of the mountains to steal the cows, they destroy the hide there. So we went to the ranchers to find out how they could stop branding the hide so much, and they said, well, it wasn't their fault. They said, es la culpa de la vaca. It's the cow's fault. So we didn't cover this in any business classes or in monitor training. And we thought, well, what do you mean it's the cow's fault? They said, well, the cows are stupid in Colombia. The cows rub their hides up against the barbed wire fence, and they destroy their hides. And so it's really the cow's problem, right? So finally we went to talk to the cows. And we asked them what the problem was, and they said it was an IMF conditionality issue. So I just put that last part in because I know that makes Jeff laugh.
It makes me so happy.
Yeah. That's right. Well, how do we interpret this rich little story, this little metaphor? Well, if you're an economist, you might say, get rid of the tariffs. It's a market distortion. If you're a business strategist, you might say, well, focus on market segmentation and find out who you can serve and how to serve. If you're a lawyer, you would probably start and say, you know what, there's no protection for intangible property rights, therefore innovation can't take place. So everybody, the NGOs would say, well, we have to go in there and we have to teach people how to build fences around the cows that don't hurt the cows. Everybody would have their own point of view. And this is part of the dilemma of development right now. And that's why I'm so happy with the introductions by Judy and Sarah, because they set us up to say, this is about perspectives. This is about government and private sector and so many other people. This is about their perspectives. Now, where are we going with all this? Once we decide that there are many domains that have a right to opine on the development issue, not just the business strategist, the macroeconomist, not just the people who study culture and attitudes, but also the people who care about knowledge capital, information flows, information systems, the people who care about human science and how biology and health drives development. I know it's a big interest of both the other panelists. This is how development's going to have to happen. And I'll make a prediction that in the next few years, because of conferences like this and the fact that the business school and the Kennedy School can come together and work to produce something like this, not a simple product, to get this done, I predict that we're going to move towards an era of real change processes and real change management, where the economists and the business strategists and the sociologists are going to come together and say, we've got to work on the ground to figure out how to diffuse these messages out there, and that's how we're going to get development. And it's beginning to happen. The World Bank, under the leadership of Jim Wolfenson, has begun to do his comprehensive development framework. It's got some good press in Business Week. It got some bad press in the Financial Times 2 days ago. I'm just glad my name wasn't in there, because we're helping him to do that. And I know Wolfenson well enough to know that couldn't have been a very happy experience seeing that article. But Wolfenson's a visionary, and he's on the right track. And changing the mind of the bank is going to be a tough thing to do. And the bank is a special group of people that are well-intentioned and brilliant. But when you get more than a few world bankers in the room, the average IQ begins to go down. It really does. These are people with an average IQ of 145, and you get 10 of them in the room, and the group IQ is at like 90. And I say this to them, as I'm not afraid to say it on the video or whoever else is listening, because this is what really has to be done. We need to move towards this integrated approach, and people have to sort of change their minds. I would finish with the following comment. In the past, prosperity used to be the private sector parentalizing the government for access to raw materials and protection for their markets. That's how prosperity used to be thought of. In the future, prosperity is going to be regarded as a choice, as an integrated set of choices that cuts across many domains. And the quality of our ability to work together will determine our ability to make economic development better. So I would say prosperity is a choice, and what remains to be seen is if people in this room and across the developing world are prepared to make those choices. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you very much, Michael. Thank you very much. Professor Sachs, your turn.
Thank you very much. I could have told you it was IMF conditionality before you went all through that route. It usually is in the end. Well, it's a pleasure to be here, especially to share the panel with such distinguished individuals. And I want to congratulate the students that have organized this couple of days, which I think are extremely important, and for me very gratifying to find the interest, the involvement, and the quest of people to be involved right now in these problems. I don't think, unfortunately, it's a universal feeling in our societies to be involved in this way Unfortunately, I think in the United States right now there is a remarkable degree of neglect and ignorance, in fact, about what's happening in the rest of the world. And it's a very troubling time, in fact. A few years ago, I would have been much more optimistic about the topics that we're talking about. I think the end of communism was certainly a period of where one could dream the highest hopes and have the highest aspirations that the world really could be put right faster than we had any right to expect. But now, 10 years later, 10 years after the fall of the Berlin Wall and the end of communism, we are in the midst of a terrible bombing campaign. And whether it's right or wrong, I can't figure out, but I know that it's not doing any good. It's doing profound harm, killing thousands of people. It shows at a minimum that we lack the instruments to do well in the world right now. And this is probably, for me, the most troubling fact. I don't want to glibly draw comparisons, but I think it's true in finance, it's true in economics, just as it is in diplomacy and security, that we lack the instruments to do well. And even when the will is there, we're just not accomplishing what we ought to be accomplishing. The IMF doesn't leave a scorched earth, but it does leave a collapsed economy more often than not. And it, again, without making stupid analogies or sounding too glib, we do a lot of damage to people that we're trying to help in the financial markets. We do a lot of damage to people that we're trying to help through IMF, World Bank programs right now. We are pretty good at self-justification, but I can't say that any of this is working very well. And that, I think, is what the real starting point for us has to be. Development, in one sense, should be a lot easier than it is. You know, poor countries have one great thing going for them, and that is that they have a world of technology that they ought to be able to draw upon, limitless world capital markets that they ought to be able to draw upon, and opportunities that simply weren't there for the now rich countries when they were poor. And in fact, economics is, the hardest part about economics is overcoming the trained incapacity that comes in this field, because all our economic models are so relentlessly optimistically biased that it's very hard to figure out what's going on, because if you write down a growth model, countries grow. And developing countries tend to grow faster than poor countries, and it's almost hard to get that out of the models, actually. So development is a real puzzle, and it's filled with unsolved paradoxes so far. Why is it so darn hard to get economic growth going in a sustainable way when, in principle, you have all of these fabulous opportunities around to apply the most remarkable development of knowledge that mankind has ever achieved? If you look at what's happening in the development process right now, it's really an unlovely picture. There are some bright spots. I'd say the most important bright spots are that both India and China have made real advances in the last decade and even in the last 25 years in living standards. This is a region of, those two countries constitute almost 40% of the world's population and a very high proportion of the world's poor. So the fact that China is growing and that India has started to achieve faster growth is very heartening, and we should never diminish the importance of that for a global perspective on what's happening. But if you look at the rest of the world, I'd say the story is a lot more troubling. The transition, so-called, in Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union, with the exception of Poland, Slovenia, few other places, the Baltic states, has been a dreadful disappointment, a shocking disappointment, I would say, and presents a lot of unsolved problems. Latin America, where 50 years ago was considered a developed region, essentially, in large parts of South America, and where prospects looked pretty bright, let's say 75 years ago, has had such a difficulty in sustaining the development process over any length of time that, again, very deep problems are raised. And of course, in sub-Saharan Africa, there is simply no good news. There are some wonderful leaders accomplishing small miracles, but the overall situation in sub-Saharan Africa is beyond comprehension, actually. The AIDS epidemic will become the worst epidemic in human history since the Black Death of 1347, unless some miracle occurs that does not seem to be on the horizon right now. 2/3 of all of the world's HIV cases are in sub-Saharan Africa. In southern Africa, you have about 25% of the adult sexually active population HIV positive in a number of countries. And the situation doesn't look much better if you turn to some of the more traditional disease burdens, such as malaria and others, where drug resistance and ecological change are probably making things worse at a rapid rate rather than better. And then, of course, if it wasn't all tough enough, a couple of years ago, the most successful developing countries in the world in the last 30 years, the Southeast Asian countries and Korea, fell into a crisis, the depth of which don't quite rival the Great Depression, thank God, but definitely are more serious than anything that they or we have seen for decades. And then, lo and behold, those countries were told by Washington, that while they had grown for 30 years, everything was wrong with them. So everything they thought they were doing right was wrong, because they were a bunch of corrupt, cronyistic, deformed economies that needed change. And so don't even believe that you did well the preceding 25 years. It was all some kind of mirage. Of course it wasn't. That was just the spin that came from the IMF and the World Bank to give those institutions maximum bargaining power vis-a-vis the East Asian countries. Well, it's all a very unsettling picture, and it's not good enough to, A, despair, although despair is not a bad starting point for thinking. B, it's not good enough just to be interested, although that's definitely the right starting point. C, it's also important to try to figure out what's going on and to try to come up with some ideas and some concepts that might be useful. And once you have those concepts, it ought to be possible to do a bit better job in helping the process along as well, because a lot of effort actually does go into this, but the results are something like the Kosovo situation. They just don't help the people we're trying to help enough. We put $180 billion of bailout packages together for Korea, Thailand, Indonesia, Russia, and Brazil. There aren't very many happy campers there right now. A lot of money went in, a lot of US banks got bailed out, and European and Japanese banks got bailed out, but not a lot of good was done for the people in those countries so far. Well, what kind of sense can we make of this? I'll be very, very brief. I think one starting point that might be helpful for you to conceptualize this is that probably even more than in the real estate business, In the business of economic development, the first three factors of importance are location, location, location. If you look at where development does tend to succeed, it's around the immediate peripheries of the already developed countries, because there is a kind of geographic pull, which is very important. So the northern rim of Mexico, with all its poverty and problems, is actually developing a lot because there's a lot of industry and business locating there. If you look in Eastern Europe, which places are working, it's exactly the countries contiguous to Western Europe. It's Poland, it's Hungary, it's the Czech Republic, it's Slovakia, it's Croatia, it's Slovenia, it's Estonia. This is basically a geographic pull. You have to do the right policies, but geography sure does give a big hand, because if you do the right policies in Mongolia, you do not get the results that Poland got. So the first point is that for countries within the periphery of the richer countries, actually development probably isn't so hard to figure out, although there are lots of mistakes that can be made. Big challenges, but there's a kind of process that the textbooks more or less do understand. I'd say the same with North Africa. Tunisia and Morocco grow pretty well. The fact that Libya and Algeria does not shows how much domestic disaster, domestic politics can destroy societies. But you can also see that geography does play a role there. Those countries within that range do get seriously tripped up by financial crises. And so that's one area to understand better. So Korea, which is in the periphery geographically of the Japanese economy, or Mexico, which went through a terrible crisis in 1994, and so forth, are vulnerable to financial market crises. The only thought I'll leave you with here, I just have to say it, the IMF does not help. It generally hurts in these situations. And it's a real problem for the international community that the world's most powerful economic institution is just not helpful. But I'd be more than happy to elaborate later on. The bigger and more difficult and intractable problems in development are for the countries not in that geographic neighborhood, but in regions that are in one form or another profoundly geographically disadvantaged, far away from markets, landlocked or highly mountainous countries, and in particular tropical environments of all sorts, where the disease burden and agricultural difficulties are profound. 91% of the land area of sub-Saharan Africa is tropical in the geographic tropics. It's no accident that 100 years of agricultural projects, first under colonial rule and then under World Bank guidance, has done extremely little compared to the goals of those programs, because there's some very deep scientific unsolved problems with relation to the ecologies of agriculture in tropical zones. The same is true with health. I can't stress enough how many of the health problems in the developing world have an incredibly strong ecological component. So it's not strictly, as Michael says, a choice whether to have malaria or not. If you live in the hard tropics, you'll have malaria, period. Except if you happen to be very lucky to live on a small island where you can shoo off the mosquitoes and they can't fly back. But if you live in the landmass of Africa right now, you will have malaria, whether the government tries or doesn't try, whether the private sector tries or doesn't try. If you do have malaria, you will get sick, because there is no scientific prevention or cure for inhabitants of these countries except for short-term visitors from outside. If you do get sick repeatedly, you might die if you're young, and you might suffer anemia or lifelong debilities as you grow up and achieve a limited kind of acquired immunity as you get older. when I step back to think about what that means, the fact that you have these really deep problems that make development more than a choice, it does seem to me that there are a couple of implications. First, I have my very profound doubts that IMF, World Bank style reform programs are really what development problems are about right now. I would like to keep all of them home and reprogram all of that money to help promote a malaria vaccine or to help promote further research in tropical agriculture, to understand how to get a higher output of maize in a humid tropical environment, or how to get better cassava production to avoid various rusts and pests and other things which destroy productivity, or how to make weak soils in rainforest environments hold nutrients because they don't. And fertilizer even doesn't work in these places because of the intrinsic properties of weak soils under high temperatures and high rainfall conditions in the tropics. I guess what I'm saying is that in the end, a huge part of the problem is knowledge. It's not that it's will or politics or better conditionalities. We still lack a real understanding. Now, the first point is we lack a proper empathy. Not the people in this room, thank God, but the people in our country do not understand yet the miracle of our lives and the challenge for the rest of the world. And this has to be the first point. Second, we have to completely rethink, in my opinion, the aid process. We need to mobilize ideas. We need to mobilize information. We need to mobilize technology. We need to mobilize global science. And we need that a lot more than what we're sending right now, which ain't working. You are people that can do that. The carriers of that technology, those ideas, that science is going to be heavily in the private sector. It's very heavily in the private sector. It's going to be heavily in the academic community. It will also be, importantly, in government institutions as well. The partnership concept is right as long as we're partnering about the right things. What we really do need to do, and that's why I'm thrilled about the topic of the discussion in the next 2 days, is to figure out how to get the partnership really working, but in the areas that are of crucial importance that will define the success of this venture. I'll mention just briefly one final example, and then I've been told that I've gone on hours too long. On Monday, we will have at the Center for International Development a meeting which I find one of the most thrilling ventures that I've been part of for a long time. And that is bringing together leading scientists from academia, national institutes of health, and the pharmaceutical companies to talk about strategies for mobilizing world science to promote a malaria vaccine, and to think about new and clever forms of aid, of assistance to get that done, rather than sending money to tell, well, I won't go into it, rather than doing what we're doing, maybe what the rich countries can do, and this is the particular project that we're exploring, maybe the rich countries can make a commitment that if the private sector, building on the basic science of the public sector, can develop an effective vaccine, that the rich countries of the world stand ready through a trust fund to buy this vaccine and deliver it for use on an annual basis, on a reliable market basis for the future years. And that commitment would be a powerful magnet for the private sector, the profit-oriented private sector, to get moving and start paying the kind of attention to malaria that they already do to diseases of the rich. And so if we can think through clever ways innovative ways to give the incentives, I think this partnership can be an extremely powerful instrument in the years ahead. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Sachs. We now have a few moments for the panelists to discuss the hotly contentious points that they raised amongst each other, and then I'll open it up for discussion for questions from the audience. I'd like to kick off the questions with a question that many of you alluded to about the levels and nature of international assistance, of aid, in the post-Cold War era. We've heard the amounts are decreasing. We've heard we don't have the tools that we need to be able to address the kinds of economic challenges that we face in the developing world. We've heard that the needs are changing. I'd love to hear perspectives from each of you about where you see the business of international development in terms of foreign assistance in the next 5 years, and where you'd like it to be in the next 5 years. Maybe we can start with Ms. Bellamy.
I was still trying to figure out where the incentive for the private sector was to do this trust fund, which I would like to ask in a moment. If I might, just building on that, and then I'm trying to answer your question. Because along the line of talking about malaria, just a reminder around disease issues, for example, there are a number of vaccines that are on the market that still are just priced too costly to go into poor countries. The measles vaccine, which actually kills, measles, which kills, not the vaccine, but measles vaccine was on the market for about 20 years or so before the pricing could be influenced enough to get it into the market. I say that because, again, UNICEF is a major purchaser of polio vaccine, which gets it in. And then I raise, where's the incentive? Because I'm very interested in this, because there are a whole series of vaccines that we call new, but are real, that would prevent disability and death. But in fact, pharmaceutical companies have come to the World Bank and WHO and UNICEF to figure out how you do it. So I'm trying to figure out where we create that incentive, because I think it's a terrific idea, and one could only wish that it would happen around both the malaria vaccine and the AIDS. I share your view entirely. The impact of HIV/AIDS in terms of not only stalling growth, but virtually reversing advances that have been made is so extraordinary. The last thing I would say, again in comment, is the one factor that wasn't mentioned, which is also, at least from our perspective, increasingly inhibiting to an enormous degree the potential for any kind of development, is the increasing amount of conflict in the world today. Certainly war conflict, but economic conflict, violence, I should say, wars and economic violence. Well, I mentioned development assistance or foreign aid, or however it's called. One would hope that it would increase when one realizes the amount of wealth that exists in the world today. It really is quite appalling that development assistance is going down. Again, from my perspective, it isn't just a question of more, it's how it is used. And I think that is part of the challenge to which I think is important, to rethink some of our aid policies as they are in the past. But there doesn't seem to be any difficulty in finding the resources at this point in time for the military engagement right now. But I dare say that whatever happens in the Kosovo area, the minute the television cameras leave, the financial resources for the humanitarian crisis will be reduced quite dramatically. So I am not optimistic, unfortunately, about development assistance going up. I would hope it would, but I think going up alone without thinking about how it is used and looking at the tools that might be available today is not enough. It would just, I do think that the two have to go together.
Thank you. Yep, go ahead.
Yeah, I've had a very specific experience in the last month where I was visiting an African country and working with the World Bank team to look at their strategies and to look at how their money is being allocated. And I was stunned because I'd always heard this, but I never experienced it. More than half of the money that's being allocated to this country in the upcoming year is being allocated to the country to repay its debt. And we're talking about $365 million, $220 million is going to be to repay the debt. And it's a classic example of a country that Jeff is talking about. 40% of the people have HIV, and 70% live on less than $1 a day. And when you ask the government what they're going to do about AIDS, they say, well, when it gets bad enough, the people will stop having sex. So you can kind of pick where you want to slice into this issue, depending on your particular frame of reference. But one of the things that I think, I haven't seen anyone attribute this to Jeff. Maybe I'll be the first one to do it publicly, maybe not. But he's been very strident in debt relief issues around Africa. And I think because he's a bit of a thorn in the side of the multilaterals, they don't give him credit. But the HIPC initiative of the highly indebted poor countries that is currently underway, 2 countries have already passed it, several others are slated to, where a trust fund will be developed in order to help these countries pay off their debt more rapidly. I have to believe that you have your fingerprints on that somewhere, even though I don't think they're likely to give you a lot of credit for it. This is where this has to be done so that the money that is slated to go in there can go into this enabling environment, human capital development, human science, the medical issues, knowledge capital, the ideas of sophisticated man-made capital, infrastructure in ports and airports, not prestige projects, but things that move products to foreign markets where they can get more money for them, and more profit can be brought back. This is fundamental to the aid equation right now. The other thing that I think is the huge gap, and I think this might be viewed as a little parochial as a business strategist, but I never see anybody talking about where the real discontinuous leaps in productivity, the growth, is really going to come from very poor countries. And Paul Romer over at Stanford has his notion of the idea gap, which he's empirically derived and studying the Asian nations, and he's probably right that it's the diffusion of ideas about business strategy, about economics, about these other things we're talking about into these countries that's so fundamental to their growth. But we're not putting enough money into experiments and pilot studies. Jeff might want to do it in export processing zones, which I think is probably a good idea. But things like that incubate great ideas, foster innovation, create a competitive context, connect these countries out there to the world, because we're spending too much time worrying about palliatives and redistribution issues, which are all great, but they're not sufficient for creating the growth that's got to come. So I am trying to push, in whatever small influence I have, the people I work with, to try to think about where's the productivity, the leap in productivity going to come from that really does create prosperity for the average citizen.
Thank you very much, Jeff.
Thanks a lot. Well, I can only join in saying with Michael that this debt issue, of course, is so simple and yet so frustratingly, agonizingly slow to be resolved. These countries can't pay back the debt. If I were doing the strategy, it would be very simple. I would get a lot of them together, and they would all stop the same moment and say, forget it, it's over. Don't dream about it anymore, don't bother us. And the world would never dare go back to these countries to say, we demand from you with your 75 cents a day that you service this money. The problem is that they want to be very good in their public behavior and very respectful to Washington. Then Washington says, pay. And it's really quite remarkable. The big successes that the cases where I've watched and been involved in big successful reforms, the countries have unilaterally defaulted on their debt. And that was always my advice. It's the best way to get debt relief that I know of is just to take it. And don't think that you can't shame the world into this, because eventually the world can be shamed, but they're too scared to do it. I've only had a few successes in convincing countries to default on their debts, and when they do, they like the results. I'll tell you parenthetically that in 1989 I went on a little tour of Warsaw and Budapest to explain my views of how to do post-communist reform. And they said, but Professor Sachs, we have so much debt, and I told them both, just blow it off. Don't worry about it, just announce that you're post-communist now, that's communist debt, it's over. And the Hungarians thought I was crazy, and the Poles may have been so desperate, which is maybe how I ever am able to keep a foot in a country, that they decided that they would go with that, even though the Prime Minister was told by his informants in Washington that I was a very dangerous person. So the Poles actually defaulted. The Hungarians paid. Hungary has had an extremely hard time compared to what was expected of its reforms, because it inherited such an incredible burden of indebtedness that it was a shame that it was demanded to be repaid. This was all communist-era debt. Poland defaulted, and 2 years later negotiated a $16 billion reduction in debt. And then it went back to the capital markets and borrowed with a lower spread than Hungary. And the Hungarians, of course, were very upset. They said, we behaved and we have a higher risk premium. I said, yes, but you have more debt, you see. You know, it's, the risk premium comes from your ability to pay. Now, is it immoral to do this? Quite the contrary. It's obscene to ask for the repayment of these debts. It is just absolutely obscene that we even talk about this issue, that we waste time, because we've got to get to AIDS, we've got to get to disease, we've got to get to real development. But unfortunately, these countries are so wrapped up in the Washington game because they're so desperate that they just don't feel the confidence to say no more. And so we're where we are. But the answer, that is a part of the answer. A second thing we need really a lot of money, not in the IMF and not in the World Bank. I'd be very thrilled to put it in UNICEF, to buy and deliver measles vaccines, HIV, the new HIV vaccine, rotavirus. There's all sorts of existing technology not used on the shelf because there's no money. It's just unbelievable. And the good thing is you have so much experience and demonstrated capacity in this, so I'll make a complete novice remark, but my sense is that the American Congress, as allergic as it is to foreign assistance, is actually not allergic to providing money for spreading measles vaccine or rotavirus vaccine and so forth. What they don't like is the money down the rat hole argument. And so it is the failure of this administration, the one before it, to come up with a convincing case of how you actually use the money in a proper way. That's the biggest disappointment for me. I know that my friends in this administration haven't done a darn thing. They haven't had the guts one time to go to Congress to ask for something more and something real. And they're stuck with getting the $18 billion from the IMF. And they're stuck with all of the process money rather than the vaccine money and the direct delivery where we have something that really can be done and is already of proven value. That's the second point. Third point, what we really ought to do, in addition to where you already have the science, is make the science. And just the explanation, what I'm suggesting is not that the companies put up the trust fund, but that the G7 or G10 establish a trust fund. Our arithmetic goes something like the following. This is very simple-minded, but just as an example. When we talk to the drug companies, when we look at the experience, suppose you put even $40 per regimen per year per vaccine for an effective malaria vaccine. There are 25 million births in Africa every year. Suppose you brilliantly could deliver the whole thing, that would be $1 billion a year. $1 billion a year is 6% of the annual ODA to Africa right now. It's also a tiny fraction of, it's a fraction of 1% of African GDP itself, where every study of malaria shows that the burden of disease is several percent of GDP, at least 1 or 2%, and probably 1% or maybe 0.5% growth per year, not just level. So The argument that I would make and want to make to our administration and to the Congress is that this would be the greatest buy of foreign assistance. Put up the trust fund. Don't spend a penny until the vaccine is there. We're not asking you to make it. We're not asking you to even do the science. The science should be done in the private sector. You get biotech firms like crazy, as well as the major pharmaceuticals, swarming for a guaranteed $1 billion a year vaccine market. That's actually pretty big stuff, as you know. So I've sampled a number of companies, and we've got a lot of them coming to our meeting next Monday. $1 billion a year is pretty convincing for them to do the underlying science. I talked to one of the biotech firms that is doing the gene sequencing. It will not be long to do a full sequencing of the plasmodium genome to identify vaccine sites. In other words, the scientific steps, it's going to take 5 or 10 years, but it can be done. But there's no market, so nobody does it right now. So the idea is get the commitment out there. It doesn't cost a penny if it doesn't work. That's the nice idea. You only pay once it's there, and that's the thought. Final point I'd like to make, especially for the private sector, the IT revolution really is a revolution, as you know. It's not just a cliche. And we haven't yet figured out, I would say, or seen enough demonstrated cases of how to mobilize it for development. But there are wonderful, wonderful small things going on which suggest that really wiring the world, or as MIT said in its conference last week, unwiring the world, because they're interested in using the low orbital geosynchronous satellites, unwiring the world, but getting connectivity at the village level throughout the developing world could be of absolutely profound importance for these issues. You can do health over the internet, you can do education over the internet, you can do ideas over the internet. The farmer can get the weather forecast, find out when the trucks are leaving, find out when the ships are leaving from the main port, communicate with the buyers, get Michael's value chain working, get the logistics reduced, and so forth. The costs of the logistics reduced. This is going to be, I think, the most exciting private sector area, purely private sector area, because when I start adding it up and when you start thinking about the incredible reduction of costs once the Teledisic and others come online, this is actually going to be a private financeable deal. And we're going to be able to really connect people that have never been connected before. And if you can figure out what to do at that end and how to get these services delivered through the private sector, I think this is really going to be an area where you can both do good and do well.
Thank you, Jeff. Any other comments up here before we open it up for questions? Nope. Okay, those of you who have questions, please move to microphones. There are 2 on the ground floors here, and there should be some also up on the second floor. Briefly, your question, and also if you can let us know who you are and where you're from, that'd be terrific. Let's start here in the corner.
I'm Diane Lavoie, and I am with USAID. I want to strongly agree and also send up a pretty strong, bright yellow caution light about some comments, particularly Jeffrey's.
We love USAID. I forgot to say that 3 times.
That's actually terribly important. I think we have several very, very strong messages. I'm going to start with just, and it won't be a question, just 2 comments, if you'll bear with me. One is, it's the students and your younger brothers and sisters who, frankly, I'm most interested in getting to. I am very inspired that the Scandinavian countries have programs in place that have all high school and even younger students learning about development, dedicating 1 day a year to actually go out and bag groceries or something and earn money and dedicate this money to development. It doesn't do much for development, but it does a great deal for them because they learn about it. We are now, one tiny thing we're doing, an unfunded thing, actually we're doing as volunteer employees at AID, is spending time going out and working with schools all over their country, trying to pilot the same kind of thing. So if you can spread the word, it's called Operations Day's Work, and frankly, I think it has more to do with turning around the obscenity of the drop in aid than probably a lot of what the rest of us are doing. But I do want to also say, let's not overstate and let's be careful, because I don't think it would be right, and I don't think you would agree, actually, with the proposition that it might sound like we're saying that somehow or other development so far has been a failure. There have been, and there are a tremendous amount of achievements over the last few years. We have a book that is glossy and propaganda-like as it looks. It actually is worthy of reading. I think it's quite interesting. It reflects the work of about 17, it's basically the Tidewater Group, so it reflects a lot of ODA across the world over the last 30 years. Look at it, judge it yourself. I also say be careful about just looking for scientific breakthroughs. We need them. We need that kind of creativity. But oral rehydration therapy is not a silver bullet if you don't also have some of the political will and social organization in a society that will clean out the ditches and provide for sanitation.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Clapping? Yes, over here.
Sergei Kasyanov, mid-career student from Ukraine. I would like to ask, could this flood of violations in post-totalitarian countries be avoided, or maybe it was some necessary stage due to season of totalitarian pressure? Thank you.
Thank you. Jeff, do you have any comments on that?
I think there are, first, let me say a word about the geography of the transition economies, because I have to just clarify one thing. They're not tropical, that's good news. Actually, in a quite serious way, they don't face a lot of the challenges of the poorest countries in the world in terms of health or agricultural productivity. Ukraine was a breadbasket of the world, of course. I think their distinctiveness geographically is that they're farther away from Western Europe, and a lot of them are landlocked, fortunately not Ukraine. Ukraine's close enough that it doesn't have to be doing as badly as it's been doing. I'd say politically and socially, the distinctive aspect of the transition economies is the complete obliteration of civil society almost as a definition of what the totalitarian regimes were. If you were smart and independent and brave, you're dead by 1991. There were precious few counterexamples to that, because these were societies that slaughtered their best for decades, and the costs are phenomenal. The result is that government in the post-communist world has been extremely disappointing, because it is not at all, it's not at all limited by civil society, if I can say. So you can have the worst kinds of corruption and abuses without any organized voice saying anything, because they don't know, because society's disorganized, it's despondent, and it doesn't have a means to respond. I always found in Poland probably the most distinctive aspect, as I compared working in Poland, Ukraine, and Russia, for example, was that Poland had the Catholic Church, it had solidarity trade union movement, and it had the peasants' movements. And all three were opposed to to many of the specifics of the reforms, but without those groups, reform would have been totally 100% impossible, because those three aspects of civil society made sure that the government was honest, was trying, was responsible, and so forth, and it made a huge difference. Whereas in Ukraine and Russia, the abuses have been beyond belief, with almost nobody saying anything. Now, my disappointment has been we haven't said anything here either. Chernomyrdin governed over an absolutely corrupt administration, but he was our partner. Same in Ukraine has happened. This is a terrible problem. We had a Ukrainian prime minister that was taking IMF loans and all the rest, and he showed up with an attaché case filled with cash and false passports at the US just a few weeks ago.
Under indictment.
Under indictment. And the point is, we didn't say anything also, so where was our standard in this? We were playing games of our own. One last thought. My big hope in all of this at the beginning was that we would be so energized, so involved, and sufficiently generous that we would actually help to make the transition work on decent and ethical terms, knowing that there was not the underpinning of civil society at the beginning to provide the internal restraints. But the West was absent from all of this. The IMF is not a substitute for Western involvement, and IMF loans are no money at all when you look at them. So there was no help, no financing, and no ethical standards on our side to speak of, and the result has been dreadful.
Thank you. Carol?
I'm shifting gears a little bit and commenting on the other. I do think, again, without having rose-colored glasses, it is important to recognize that there have been successes in development. And again, talking from our perspective, just fewer children die today than just 10 years ago from totally preventable reasons. And that it doesn't necessarily need, although I think we should take advantage of science, it doesn't need necessarily to have complicated interventions. Even the most simple, you mentioned oral rehydration salts. The fact that the major cause of retardation in cognitive development in a child is the lack of a small amount of iodine in the diet, and the ability to get that iodine into the diet through something as simple as iodized salt, and the really understandable, low-cost, low-tech types of steps to do that is extraordinary. So that you have a world where in 1990 about 12% of the salt consumed in the developing world was iodized. Today it's over 70%. That makes a difference. Fewer children are mentally retarded. More kids are in school today than ever before. 80% immunization, at least in some basic diseases. So I think it is important to recognize that development assistance has made a difference. Not all of it, and there is the black hole in some case, but has made a difference. There have been advances. It doesn't require necessarily new scientific breakthroughs. That being said, I think we should very much try and take advantage of the tools that the age that we live in provides us today. And since we've all stood here and said the pandemic, in different ways, the pandemic of HIV/AIDS has the potential of reversing what gains have been made, that if in fact using science and new technologies, one can ultimately come to some kind of a scientific intervention, then the challenge in the short term before that presents itself is to try and at least forestall the implications. So let's not get carried away with technology. On the other hand, let's not avoid the use of technology to try and move the advancements further ahead at a more rapid pace.
Thank you. Moving the technology on the second floor. Someone's at the microphone upstairs.
Hello, my name is Malik Fall. I'm a second-year student here at the Kennedy School, and I come from Senegal. My question is for Professor Sachs. In the 2 years that I've been here, I've been very happy to see you as an advocate of development and of changing the mindset of the development community. But I'm still confused about one thing which seems to me like a paradox, because on one hand, you are advocating, sending more vaccines in developing countries, but on the other hand, you are mentioning that location is critical to development. So my question is, what is the point of sending vaccine to people who live in landlocked countries if they're going to die anyway?
What I'm saying is that if you take a look at where development has really been frustrated and where it's been successful, there's a tremendous geographical component to that. And it's true in every continent, every region. Whether it's the southern part of the Americas, the most southerly part is Argentina and Chile, which is the richest part of the region. Whether it's in Africa, whether it's in Asia, you see these powerful geographical tendencies. When you look more deeply at those, it seems to me that the signal that they're suggesting is that the health burden and the agricultural productivity are very much geographically related. They are not deterministically given, though, but they are a real fact of life right now. So whether it's malaria or schistosomiasis or many other so-called vector-borne diseases, this is a very heavy burden that the tropics bears that the temperate zones do not bear at all. My reason for pointing these things out is partly to try to help myself and others understand why we see the patterns that we do, but also where we ought to be directing our efforts. Because I think we fell, unfortunately, into a pretty glib era, so-called era of the Washington Consensus, that economic reform was the beginning but also the end of economic development challenge, and that if you just try hard enough, it will be solved. I think what I'm suggesting, what I'm meaning to suggest is not that any of this is deterministic, but that we can actually do something about it only if we direct our attention to these issues. Let me give you not a health example, but another example, the so-called Consultative Group for International Agricultural Research, what's the CGIAR. This is the network of tropical agricultural research centers. They had a great contribution to the Green Revolution, which was essentially for irrigation, wheat and rice in Asia. It barely touched Africa. In recent years, the budget of the CGIAR has been falling sharply, in nominal as well as, or especially in real terms. And I noticed that if you look at the spending just by 3 state research labs in this country, California, New York, and Florida, they spend more on agricultural research than the whole world system of tropical agriculture right now. So that's what I'm trying to get at, that we ought to not throw up our hands and say it's hopeless, but to understand that maybe the lessons of history are teaching us where to direct the efforts more. Now, vaccines will save lives, there's no doubt about it, even under current conditions. So if you have, and polio is about to be eradicated, this is a great triumph of the human will, smallpox was. We have a measles vaccine which is grossly underused. We actually have technology for getting tuberculosis under control, which is still one of the major killers in the world, but it's not applied. So I think things can be done, definitely. I also think that there are major things that we don't know because scientific effort is not directed at them. I'm very concerned that even more imbalanced than world wealth and GNP is world scientific effort right now. 99% of it comes from the temperate zones, and very little tropical zone research is getting done. So my point is not that anybody is deterministically bound by one's fate, but that under our current scientific understanding, we've spent so much time on temperate zone seed hybrids and genetic recombination, and much too little in the tropics, and the same with disease. That's where I think our attention ought to be put.
Thanks, Jeff. Michael, you have a comment?
Yeah, I just want to give a view on location that's not 100% consistent with what Jeff's saying, but I just want to put it out there because I think if I walked away, I feel bad that I didn't say it when I had the opportunity, which is, I think I understand Jeff's ideas on location, and I think they hold very nicely at the national kind of aggregate level. You know, Bolivia does a lot worse than Colombia, and it's landlocked, and I think there's wonderful evidence of that. But there's also lots of anecdotal evidence, and I don't know how it adds up or how it reconciles with the way that you looked at it, but I want to throw out just a few examples because it may reconcile at some level and it may not. I mean, Colombia, in the 5 or 6 major cities that they have, the richest one in purchasing power is Medellin, that is incredibly landlocked, really only has 2 roads that leave out of it. And the poorest cities are Barranquilla and Cartagena with up to 40% poverty rates, and they have access to the United States and they're right on the ocean. And Barranquilla even had terrific long port and wonderful human capital for some years. And their advantage got destroyed very quickly by the Panama Canal, and it led to opportunities in the port of Buenaventura on the west coast of Colombia and all the way down to Lima. But it's an example of a city that where is producing more productivity, more economic growth than anywhere else in the country, and it has the absolute worst geographic location. A second example right now is Uganda's purchasing power for the first time in 20 or 30 years has just surpassed Kenya's. And Uganda's landlocked, and it uses all the roads through Kenya out to Mombasa port in order to export. And so I just want to make sure that the location theory is put in its proper context. And I hope and trust Jeff would also say that when the government of Kenya is so much worse than the government of Uganda, that supersedes the locational advantage. Or when the business strategies of the conglomerates in Medellin are so superior to the business strategies of the people, of the companies in Barranquilla, that also supersedes the locational advantage. So location is an advantage, but it's a basic advantage, and there are ways of transparent, predictable, uncorrupt government and fabulous, learned, informed strategic choices of companies that can supersede the locational advantage. And I can give you lots of anecdotal evidence. I've never figured out how to aggregate it up into a compelling empirical thing, but they're out there.
Okay, up here.
Hi, I'm an MPP1. My name is Seema Ahmed. I wanted to say I appreciate your position regarding the IMF. This is for Professor Jeffrey Sachs. I'm only beginning to understand the idea of location theory, and I'd like some elaboration on how a country like Bangladesh, where I'm from, can benefit from a country like India, which is a regional superpower.
Let me give you one example. The first, as I understand it, I wasn't there, but supposedly last week, the first bus service direct from West Bengal to Dhaka took place because up until last week, there was a very difficult border crossing process to change buses to make the trip between the two countries. If you look repeatedly all over the world, you find some. This is what Michael is rightly saying. You find some incredible lost opportunities as well. Now, one of the things I've been looking at closely is not Bangladesh's problem geographically vis-a-vis India, but landlocked countries. Part of the problem with being landlocked is that you're physically far from the coast, but maybe an equally important part is that you have to cross a national border. And that can be a bigger pain in the neck than the simple overland problem. One reason is if you need to make a road from the landlocked country to the port, you have to get two governments to agree to that. You can barely get one government to agree to anything internally, but to get two governments to coordinate, when usually the one on the outside may hate the one on the inside or be afraid of it or whatever, or the one on the inside is terrified about being invaded by the one on the outside. So Nepal rejects historically normal roads to India because they were afraid of Indian tanks coming up those roads. And it was 116 years after the War of the Pacific, which took place in 1879, that Chile and Bolivia actually paved a road so that Bolivia could drive on a paved road from La Paz to the Pacific Ocean. It's mind-boggling, of course. So certain of these geographical difficulties can be overcome. It is still true, when I was in Kigali last year, asking for transport costs to get from the coast from Mombasa to Kigali was about $2,300 for a container, which if you go from Singapore to Los Angeles is about half that price. So here you have a short stretch of a few hundred kilometers, which is more expensive because it's overland, two countries, road in disarray, and all the rest. than going halfway around the world by ship. In any event, what is true is that regional infrastructure can help a lot. It's amazing how much is missing in the world, usually for political reasons. And so those are some of the free pickings that we can have if we can just keep peace among neighbors long enough and figure out that there's mutual gains to trade.
I'm not a student of location theory, although I must say when I was at the Peace Corps, Peace Corps volunteers always thought they only went to warm countries. And when I was there, we started sending them to places like Mongolia and to the Baltics, and we had to worry about sun deprivation. So I thought we would just recruit them from Buffalo, actually. But I want to make the point, actually in India, Bangladesh, if I might, lest it not only be location, but I'll defer to some of the experts, that if you take a look at India, the strongest parts, the most active economies are generally in the south. There's a higher degree of education, investment in education. There's a lower birth rate. And so to the extent to which, I must say, at least in recent years, Bangladesh has started to invest quite a great deal more in education, and particularly in girls' education, I would argue can play a role as well, lest it only be left to factors that are entirely beyond one's ability to move your country from one part of the world to another part of the world. There are some other areas that I think also deserve consideration in terms of investment, and I would argue certainly health and education.
Agree. Yes, you've been waiting patiently. Thank you.
I wanted to ask Jeffrey Sachs, he is so critical of the IMF, which criticism I share, but what should the IMF have done when Thailand, Korea, etc. went up in flames?
And can you identify where you're from?
I'm Carol Sir from the Kennedy School.
Wonderful, thank you.
I had a wonderful idea. It was July 1997, and I was sitting next to a senior U.S. official on a panel, and a note came, "What should the IMF do?" And I wrote, "Stay home," and sent it back, and he wrote, "No, really, what should it do?" And I said, "No, really, stay home." And I truly, really meant it, and I mean it today. There are a couple of, well, there are many complex issues in this. I think that the IMF's presence actually helped to trigger the depth of the panic that took place. So the IMF was probably the most panicky of all, but when the IMF went in there with the sirens wailing and so forth, I think that it told investors, if you haven't gotten out by now, now's really a good chance to get out. So I don't think that it calmed any nerves at all. There is a whole debate, of which I'm no doubt at a far extreme end, about whether the policy prescriptions were right. The answer is no, they weren't. But I think that the presence of the IMF was not helpful. The problem right now with the IMF is that it's not good enough to stay home. The whole system is rigged that until the IMF gives the thumbs up, everything is paralyzed. Banks you don't talk directly to your creditor banks. The credit rating agencies tell you to go to hell. The World Bank, the regional development banks, nobody lends. So everything has gone through now one funnel, one incredibly narrow bottleneck, which is the IMF doing that or that. And this is very dangerous for the world, because what has happened in these crises is the most remarkably abrupt swings of private capital as the essence of the crisis. And when you have a focal point which turns the whole thing in one direction, swinging to another direction, it's very dangerous, actually. So I think that the whole system is rigged right now to cause these sudden stops or these fitful reversals. And that's why I think the whole role of the IMF really needs to be reconsidered. There's another issue. One more, sorry. The IMF has reinvented itself several times because, remember, it was established to help oversee a fixed exchange or so-called adjustable peg system, which we don't have anymore, which broke down in 1971. But it reinvented itself to help the recycling of petrodollars in the 1970s, and then it reinvented itself to solve the developing country debt crisis in the early 1980s. Then it became our agent for the transition economies in 1991. That didn't work so well. Thank God the East Asian crisis came, gave the IMF something more to do. And the other thing the IMF has done since 1980, it has been the pro-consular power of Africa. It runs most of African economy ministries. It really does. And why? Because these places are broke. Does the IMF give them any money? No. What the IMF does is give them essentially the money, as Michael said, to pay back the debt for the next year. So this terrible game is going on. Now, the justification is, well, you do all this conditionality, you get all these reforms. The IMF's been in Africa now for 20 years, and the results are dreadful. You can find some examples of great successes like Uganda, but that's not an IMF success. That, with all due respect, is Mr. Museveni's success. And I think that if one were to take a hard, serious, systematic, scholarly, if we could get the archives opened up, role of this institution, this argument, stay home and study, would be really a convincing argument. We'd even do an executive program for them.
Thank you.
I bet they'd be thrilled to do that.
We're getting short on time, and we've got people with shuttles to catch, so this is going to have to be the last question. Let's go upstairs briefly.
Hi, yes, my name is Alan Clements. I'm a land use consultant and a student at the Extension School. I'd like to just express my appreciation to Jeff for mentioning the Kosovo crisis. And along those lines of looking at values, looking at spiritual values, I just wonder if the panel, I'd like to invite the panel to comment on what a spiritual aspect towards development would look like, and its importance, its relevance, and so on. You know, as educated people, again, to the Kosovo thing, as an educated person, I mean, that type of strategy just looks really absurd. And I think we tend to think an awful lot in economic terms and force and political terms, but whether it be the spirituality of ourselves as development advocates and involved in it, and also to the people whom we wish to influence in the countries we wish to influence, I just wonder if you could speak to those issues.
Wonderful. The spiritual dimension of development. I'd like to go first.
I'd just like to say it seems appropriate that you ask that question, because up there in the light with your voice booming over the audience, you look like a spirit, or you look like God. I don't know about Kennedy School's power of convocation, but I'm really impressed if God came down to the conference. But there's no doubt in my mind. I've seen it at the grassroots level as a Peace Corps volunteer, and I've seen it as a banker and a business person and a counselor to some leaders in Africa and other places, that people's sense of self-esteem and their contentedness with their own life improves in a very Maslowian sense when they can take care of shelter and nutrition and educate their children and have clean water and things like that. And I have to believe that that the next step is to provide a greater sense of spirituality. It's almost to create the space in people's lives to let their mind and their heart move in that direction when they're not obsessed with the day-to-day survival. And so this gives me courage, because I start to see that in my quest, which is simply to create more prosperity for companies and people and countries, that it actually has that type of dimension. Even though I don't work on it specifically, I think that the work of macroeconomists, the work of well-intentioned businessmen, and even the well-intentioned people from the multilaterals, I think they do try to create that space where the type of development that you're talking about can take place.
Thank you very much. Would you like to say a word?
I'm not really going to answer your question, I suppose, but I might comment. I was actually in Albania on Saturday, Sunday, Monday, and at the border of Kukës. And clearly, from a development perspective, survival has to be the paramount response right now, whether it's clean water or medicines or shelter. For children, however, and for adults, but certainly for children, the psychological impact is something, though, that cannot wait for things to calm down. And so even as the families, and half of the people being forced out of Kosovo are 15 years or below, by at least official counts at this point. I think by eyesight it seemed larger, but I don't know. But going to the spirit, if you will, and just even engaging children in little play groups has to happen immediately and has to take place, or for all the clean water and the blankets and the shelter, the damage, the long-standing damage may not be recoverable. So there has to, the human element of development is something that is key, and it obviously applies to all, but certainly for the most vulnerable, children becomes particularly important.
Thank you very much. I'd like to thank our panelists. I did an excellent job for us this afternoon. To thank all of you who asked questions.
The spirit's gone.
Back in the vapor someplace. And
the spirit of Michelle Camdessu, however,
lingers for. I think Judy just wanted to make a quick announcement, and then we'll be free to go.
This is just a couple operational notes. A reminder to wear your name tag if you're a conference participant. That'll be our indication that you are a participant. If you haven't yet, please see our registration desk near the entrance. And secondly, I'm just going to direct you to our next session, which is 3 separate panels. The role of civil society will be taking place in Star Auditorium, which is in the next building over. Institutional partnerships for policy coordination will be taking place in room 140, which is right here. And lastly, women in international development will be in Wiener Auditorium, which is in the Taubman building across the courtyard right back here. Thank you very much. Please enjoy the conference.
It starts at 9:30.
Somewhere in HIIG.
Yeah, it's at Bell Hall here, actually.
anyway, I'm sorry.